What's up, everybody? Welcome back to your favorite New York Jets subscription podcast, Badlands. I'm your host, Joe Caporoso. Immediate initial reaction podcast to the New York Jets first round pick with Paul. The other guys, Badlands collabo that we need, we're both fresh back from the draft party. We're both wearing our quarter zips here. We couldn't go to bed until we talked about the pick a little more. Olu Fashanu, after a trade down of one spot, Jets collect now have three fourth round picks, um, a fifth round pick. They're loaded up with day three assets, but the bigger story here, they go for Shanu, a guy we haven't talked about the past few weeks all that much. Not a lot of people have talked about the past few weeks. How do you feel about the pick, Paul?
I like it. I mean, I'm on here for however long I've been with you on Badlands, like saying that I love picking offensive line in the first round every single year, no matter what, right? And so if I'm like going back to like what I think the draft is all about, I like it. Admittedly, like it took me a few deep breaths when it happened because it like the first 10 picks kind of flew by, and then we're all kind of thinking of Dunze, and then he goes off the board. And so it was just kind of like a frantic couple seconds, and then the Jets pick was it, and then the trade happens, and then when we actually picked, the pick went in like immediately, and I think everybody thought Bowers, and then when they announced Fashanu, like, all right, couple deep breaths, like let me think about it for a second, and it took me a few beats, but I got there, and I like the pick. I mean, we've been saying for months now that this offensive line is not going to play every game this year. So now there's a legitimate backup plan in place that's not Carter Warren, and it's not Max Mitchell, and it's not Bakhtiari either. Like, this is a real both short-term and long-term plan. I think the sexiness of a pass catcher, preferably wide receiver, tight end as a backup option, is something that we all really wanted. But like, if I take a deep breath and step back, this is the right pick. So I feel good.
Yeah, look, I think if you go back to the beginning of this process and you look at our draft guide, Fashanu is the number two ranked offensive tackle. And he was a guy that initially, when we started talking about this entire process, we weren't sure if he'd even be there at number 10. And then you kind of go away, you start talking about other guys. And all along, this is a guy that on most teams' draft boards was a top 10 pick. He's a number 7 overall player on Connor's big board. He is an NFL player comparison to a very familiar name to Jet fans, and DeBrickashaw Ferguson is a younger prospect at 21 years old. And it's hard with everything we've seen from the Jets in recent years to say we're unhappy with them taking arguably the second best offensive lineman in the class at a premium position at left tackle. And the question now more so becomes, when do we first see him? Because honestly, in a perfect world, he doesn't start at all this year, even though we know he's going to start at some point for Tyron Smith or for Morgan Moses. Really, he's supposed to be a pure left tackle. How many games does that translate to starting as a rookie? But if you put all that aside, like, this is a guy who very high floor, relatively high ceiling, and is going to be a good pro. So it's hard to leave disappointed with that. But I do understand some of the initial, like, look, if everyone's healthy, this guy's not going to start week one. Most likely he's going to start the season on the bench, but that doesn't mean he's not going to play and contribute at some point. Also, now, I don't like to evaluate everything in a vacuum, right? The Jets are going to have a second and third round. They're going to have a fourth round. Are they going to take these 3 fourth round picks and their third round pick, go into the second round and get a pass catcher? Is there a veteran move coming at wide receiver before we evaluate the overall depth chart? But in a vacuum, the player is a very good prospect and very good value at 10. And that's what I want to focus more of the analysis on tonight. Tomorrow, Connor and I will hop on. We'll talk about what is to be done on day 2 or day 3. But the individual player, the player comp, the grade, the ranking, it's hard to not feel good about that and the value that they got. Even if you might have been someone who wanted Bowers guilty, as charged, would have been happier probably in the moment with Bowers. This feels like something that at some point this season, and then particularly the next 2 to 5 years, there's going to be a big sigh of relief that we made this pick overall.
There's going to be a moment this year, I think, where we're going to be like, oh my God, thank God we made the pick. Right. And like, to your point, right, if we rewind back 3 months, Jake and I had a debate on the other guys about do you want to lose to the Patriots or not, right? Do you want to send Bill out with a loss, or do you want to get a better draft pick? And the entire conversation at the time was, we're going to miss on Joe Alt and Olu Fashanu if we win the game. And it turned out not to be true. Now, we did sign a tackle and we did trade for a tackle in that time period, but the further you get away from the season, when people start to move up and down boards with no football games being played, that to me is always like a little suspicious. I understand that I can't see things that pro scouts can see, so I get that. But I know, like, just as a fan, right, the further we get away from football games, when people start to move wildly, that always makes me feel a little weird. And when we stopped playing football games, Fashanu was in the top 5. And so that's kind of what I come back to. And to your other point about the rest of the picks, I mean, they have 8 picks now remaining in the draft, and 7 of them are on day 3. I don't think any of us as fans want 7 day 3 picks on the roster, right? So then the question is, what are we doing now? How are we moving in day 2 tomorrow? How early are we going to be able to pick tomorrow? We have to watch the draft right away because it could happen at any moment, right? Like, something's probably going to happen. Nobody wants 7 day 3 picks on the team. So it'll be interesting to see where we go from here. And like you said, a little bit like, it took a beat, but it's the right move. And that moment that you're talking about, it's probably going to happen this year.
It's definitely going to happen this year. And this guy is going to start a few games for Tyron Smith at left tackle. The question is going to be, if Morgan Moses gets banged up at some point, does he start a few games at right tackle? He's kind of projected as a pure left tackle, but you want to play your best 5. We've seen the Jets aren't shy about doing that. My guess off the top of my head is he starts somewhere between 5 to 10 games this year. And if he's good, then they can let Tyron Smith or Morgan Moses walk next year. He's going to start, and he's going to be a long-term starter here. Obviously, you just spend a top 10 pick on him. And the player comp I've always kind of loved from the jump since Connor and others have started throwing it around. I've seen Tunsil in a few other places. But Brick, from a style of play perspective, is right. Like, we've kind of always thought, and maybe this is Douglas learning from his mistakes a little bit, like the Jets are looking more for this, like, really big, really physical road grader, Mekhi Becton type. And that didn't work. And that could have been going to get Latham. That could have been Fuaga, more so than Fashanu. Fashanu, in some ways, a little bit more of a finesse player, but more polished, and someone who just protects the quarterback. And that's really important when Aaron Rodgers is your quarterback for the next 2 years. And it's okay to evolve. And, Douglas, I'll say this for him, he's been unpredictable the last 2 years. Nobody expected Will McDonald last year. And again, we're in this ecosystem ourselves. We see other people who do what we do. Like, not a lot of chatter about Fashanu the past few weeks. Some in the early part of the process, but it was Bowers, it was Fatanu, it was Fuaga, it was Adunze, it was Neighbors, it was trading up from Marvin Harrison Jr. Wasn't a guy that was talked about a lot because a lot of people looked at his style of play and assumed that this regime wouldn't want to move on that. But getting someone who could protect the quarterback in a pass happy league isn't a bad thing. And again, as an individual, I like the player a lot, even if we've been joking in the Badlands text, like, this is eating our vegetables in round 1. This is a vegetables pick. It's a plate of broccoli, whatever you want to call it. It's good for you. And the Jets have not done stuff that is good for them for a long time. They absolutely have work to do with pass catcher. They are Mike Williams having a bad week of rehab away from starting Alan Lazard and Xavier Gibson with Garrett Wilson week 1, which is terrifying. I have to assume that something of note is coming. And I don't know exactly what it's going to be. It's easier said than done to package all your picks and move up and get Pearsall in round 2 with a receiver that everybody wants, or a different receiver that everyone's excited about. I don't know if there's an Ayuk or Higgins trade out there. Maybe there is. Maybe something lesser like Tyler Boyd or Odell Beckham Jr. to go with the draft pick. But there's a lot of work to be done there. But when you're just talking about tonight from a value perspective, from where he ranks on most people's big board, including our own big board and including on our own draft guide, you don't leave being like, man, we reached on that guy. Will McDonald was a reach. Fashanu was not a reach at all at 11. And look, they move back a spot and get a little extra collateral. That's good, because once Adunze was gone, they were going to take him at 10 anyway. So I think holistically, it feels like the only reason I'm not going to be like, well, this is an A plus home run pick is that there is a world where we don't see him at all for a while. Like maybe the Jets finally get lucky, and this is a good world to live in where Tyron Smith is healthy and Morgan Moses is healthy, and this guy is just on the bench. Maybe he plays in some heavy sets and some jumbo sets, but like the Jets just have a first round pick who's not contributing, and that that's a thing. That's not something you could just completely ignore. But I want to see what happens with the rest of the draft. One thing I will say for sure is that I don't doubt that for a good portion of the next 10 years, this guy is going to be one of the best tackles in football, and that's a pretty damn good thing to have on the roster. So, final thoughts, PK, because it's been a long one, and then we'll put a wrap on it, and we'll be right back on the feed tomorrow morning.
Um, it gives you the good feelings that we got a pure left tackle, because there's always a little bit of that like reservation when it's like, oh, he can play both ways, he can play all over the place, he can play all five positions. Like, okay, cool, but I'd really love a guy who's just the best at his position. So the fact that he's a pure left gives you the warm and fuzzies there. But as soon as the pick was made, it started surfacing on Twitter that he's been working on the right side all offseason. Right. So you also get that other good feeling of like, okay, he is a pure left tackle, but he can go right if Morgan Moses misses some time. So that makes you feel good. The other thing that I saw that popped out at me was he's in 650 pass blocking snaps over the past 2 seasons, not a single sack allowed. So like that makes you feel pretty good too. A little bit of a subjective stat there, but it makes you feel great. And then the other thing that you laid out that scenario where we don't see him at all this year, and it's a good problem to have and all that. The final thought I would have on that is that we've put ourselves in a position where we don't have a burning code red pressing need at left tackle in next year's draft. And
Yeah.
assuming that Aaron Rodgers is going to be with us for 2 years, and that's not a totally safe assumption, but I think it's a reasonable assumption at this point. So now we can go into next year's draft like without that burning red alert, like we have to get a left tackle need, which is a good thing. Like it's good team planning, it's good future looking thinking for both the short term and the long term. So I think it all comes back to the analogy that you made. It's eating your vegetables. This is good for the team. This is the right thing. We didn't hurt ourselves. We didn't do something stupid. And it's a value pick. We got arguably the best player on the board at the spot that we picked at 11. So hard to complain.
Yes, we're not. You're twisting yourself in a little bit of a pretzel if you're like, man, this is a disaster. Man, I hated this pick. It's hard to hate the player at 11. If they took him at 4, okay, let's have a conversation. If they traded up to get him, okay, let's have a conversation. The fact that they traded back and got the asset and got him at 11, it's really hard to be overly negative on it. So before we wrap, and again, I'm going to be back on with Connor tomorrow morning where we'll review the pick, but we'll do a little more forward looking at who could they look at on night 2, who's the best available players, what else shook out in the rest of the first round. It was a pretty wild first round after kind of a chalk start. There were some picks, Penix and Bo Nix, that I'm still scratching my head at. And even some of the last picks here, how low certain people fell. I will say this: a lot of tackles went tonight, and not a lot of receivers went tonight, which bodes well for the Jets on Friday, which is exciting. Big thank you to everyone who came out to Reds tonight. Big thank you to Steve for steering the ship in the booth. Will Meigs for hopping on the mic. Uh, Everyone who came out. Andy, who was there super early. He got his brother out. The rest of the gang who's been out to all of our events. Gil, I'm forgetting different people's names because we saw a lot of different folks tonight, but it's always awesome to get to hang with everyone in person and witness these moments together as they happen. And again, like Jet fans, like they're very authentic. There was no one like doing cartwheels and backflips when they took Fashanu, right? Like they would have if it was neighbors or Dunze or Marvin Harrison Jr. because that's a normal, natural reaction. But I think most people pragmatically are like, this is a smart thing, and we've suffered from this before in the past. So now the content sprint starts for the next 72 hours. So Connor and I in the feed tomorrow morning, Dan on the feed tomorrow afternoon, reaction to pick 2 as it happens, and then we'll take it from there and kind of run the same playbook on Saturday. Will and I will put a bow on the whole thing on Sunday, and then Jake and Paul will be back Monday to put their own bow on the whole thing. Final words, Paul, before we wrap.
It was a great night. Good to see everybody. Look forward to seeing everybody at the next one.
Thank you, everyone, and we will talk to you very soon.